Could you let us know a bit about your story?
At one stage, I lived away from Australia. I lived in a place called Bangalore in the south of India. And I used to ride around in a beautiful car. It was a very nice car, but it was air conditioned and everything. But the thing was, I realised that probably in some ways from a health point of view, I wasn't really doing exercise. I was safe in the car, but in some ways I wasn't healthy. So when later on I came back to Australia, and I decided that I would actually try and do something to improve my fitness. So that's when I started to do quite a bit of bike riding. I was riding up a hill in a section of Rosanna, and unfortunately a lady came from behind me and she picked me up on the windscreen. Now, I maybe I should explain that I am actually 6'4", so I'm quite a big pickup. So I imagine what this lady saw me on a windscreen with the bike as well. I imagined something like, shit, how did that happen? She must have freaked out a little bit. And then I think she braked. And so I think maybe the first thing that happened was I hit my head on the windscreen on the right side of my head, and then she braked, and then I went backwards and I landed on the back of my head on the road. Yeah, that's how I imagine it. But I don't know what the truth is. But it was written up by the ambulance people, so that was helpful.
Yeah. So what part of your brain was damaged? What the most damaged?
What they sort of said was the right. I think they call it the frontal lobe temporoparietal. So FTP, the whole on the right side, basically the whole on the right side was heavily impacted.
Wow.
So they were actually, the way that they're talking about in medical terms, they're talking about this thing called the hematoma, which is like a big blood clot sort of thing inside your brain, but like caused by damage. So I actually had 3 of those on the right hand side, and I had 2 on the left hand side. And they also talk about the depth that they go into. So, for example, there's some that are called EDH, so it's just extradural hematoma, and there's another one called subdural hematoma. So I think I had 2 or 3 of the subdural hematomas and 1 or 2 of the epidural. So basically, I shouldn't be smiling because it's not good.
No.
Anyway, so fortunately, after that, I was picked up. Somebody, the passerbys saw the accident. They actually called the ambulance. There was an ambulance came in 10 minutes.
Wow!
And they picked me up and they took me to hospital in about 20 minutes.
That's
so
wow.
Even
That's
though
great.
I had an accident at 4:30 in the afternoon, I was at the hospital at 5 o'clock.
Amazing.
I'm telling you these things. I don't know because I was unconscious.
Of course.
But actually, it was the medical records were quite carefully done. So there was a lot of information there. So that's the only way I've learned about this. So what I could see was that a doctor that was actually checking me out at about 5:05. So I mean, I thought, hospital terms, what we hear about all the problems in the hospitals, it seemed pretty good. It actually worked pretty well for me. And then later on in the evening, they actually decided that the neurosurgeons, they decided that they would operate, and then what they were going to do is put some sort of sensor in my brain to actually see whether there's any swelling or any sort of things were a bit out of control. And then if the swelling goes too much, you get a lot of pressure on your brain, and that can cause a secondary damage. So they were quite interested in that. They wanted to monitor that. So they put a pressure sensor in my head to sort of monitor that. And then at the same time, they discovered there was quite a lot of bleeding around my eye. And so there was an ophthalmologist. So they called an ophthalmologist into the operating theatre, and he did an operation on my left eye. And sort of, I think it's called xanthomy is the name of the operation. And so basically that sort of dealt with the bleeding behind my eye and actually got the eye back into some sort of sense of reasonableness. And so the amazing thing was 6 months later, I was reassessed for my eyesight on both sides, and I had 6/6 vision. And so from my point of view, that was actually pretty good after a serious accident.
Absolutely.
And I think when I saw the doctor, he was actually pretty happy to see me. And I didn't really understand why this was. But actually later on, I figured out that basically I'm a walking advertisement for his work.
Yes, absolutely.
But I guess I'm grateful that anyway, whether it's a walking advertisement or not, I'm happy.
Yeah. So obviously, it looks like there's a part of your skull missing or something.
Yeah. So maybe there's a bit further goes on. So what happened? They were measuring the pressure in my head, as I mentioned about putting in monitoring. So they measured that every day, and so they were measuring it for about 3 weeks. And I think it was, if it got up to, I mean, my terminology is 20 psi, 20 pounds per square inch. If it got above that, then that was a problem from the neurosurgeon's point of view. So what they said is, I got one stage I got up to about 25 or close to 30, I think. So what they said is, okay, tomorrow we're operating. So, but their idea of an operation was, it's called I think this, I don't know whether I've got the right name for it, craniectomy, I think is the right term. But basically they simple terms, they got a chainsaw and they cut the skull off on this side here. You can see where it's pretty flat here. They literally took away the skull, and then they looked at the problems inside, and they tried to sort of remove as much damage as they could and try and deal with things as best they could. And then they put things back in sort of as good a form they could after the operation. I mean, I don't
So
know.
is that bone or is that a plate?
So the bones have been taken off, and what they do is they put sort of like, it's called titanium, I think.
Yep,
metal
titanium.
They put in there.
Yeah.
So that's there. And so what I had to do for the first couple of weeks after the operation, I had a bit of a helmet that they put on for me in hospital, so that if anything happened and I hit my head, then I would be protected a bit, because the brain was actually a bit exposed after the operation. So they had to be quite careful in the hospital. Yeah.
Wow, gosh, it sounds like a horror movie.
Unfortunately,
It's like,
if you look on the bright side, I did live through it. Now, one funny thing, I don't know whether you maybe not everybody see this funny, but from my point of view, later on I learned a bit about the brain, and the brain has different parts, and one part of the brain is called the brainstem, and the brainstem is actually this part above your neck. But the good thing about the brainstem is it actually controls your heart and your lungs and important things that keep you alive. So if I can look on the bright side, that I don't seem to have had much damage to the brainstem, so that was quite fortunate.
Yeah, so you're still alive.
So I'm still here.
So this only happened fairly recently, didn't it?
Well, it's coming up to 5 years in May.
5 years. Yeah. So you're quite a baby when it comes to brain injury recovery years.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile your injury at this point in your rehabilitation? How do you reconcile yourself with your injury?
Well, I think it's a little bit tricky, I have to be honest, because like when I would talk to the doctors, they would tell me all the things that could be wrong. Like they had quite a long list of issues that I would have. So, for example, one common thing is people. The part of the brain that was affected was probably the frontal, what they call the frontal lobe, and part of the prefrontal lobe is called the prefrontal lobe, which is sort of right at the front. It's sort of like your sort of controller of your whole brain. Mm-hmm. And so what they said is that the part that had been affected, like you could be quite impulsive, and you wouldn't be able to make decisions, and you wouldn't be able to do things like plan things or think through what you should do. So the slightly ironic side of this is that these are things that I used to do a lot of in my work. Mm-hmm. I was very, very busy with all of these things. So it was a little bit ironic. But the flip side, once I learned a little bit more about the brain, there's a thing called cognitive reserve. So basically, if you've actually been somebody who's actually studied a lot of you've done a lot of research, or you've done a lot of study at university, or you've done perhaps a whole lot of training where you've got a lot of discipline and very structured, which could be it could be physical activity, but it could also be some sort of mental or things that use different parts of the brain.
Yeah.
And so the fact of my situation, I was probably overusing my brain, if anything, before I had the accident. And so I think that's the only good side I can sort of see of my life, is that I probably had built up some cognitive reserve, which probably has helped me after the accident. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And a lot of these things you're saying to me are very, very familiar to me also, because I had damage to my right side and my frontal lobes as well.
Yep.
And I can remember they were telling me all those things that I would never be able to plan and things like that. And I was a vociferous diary user, and because the days were only that big, and I used to have so many appointments, I still write like a mouse. I've got tiny writing, because that's how I learnt to write, was in these tiny little days.
You could literally fit everything in.
Yeah, so I could fit everything in, exactly.
But while you were trying to fit everything in, you had a goal in your mind of what you wanted to achieve, I think.
Yes.
I'm speaking for you, but I'm just guessing.
Well, I think I relate to you a lot, David, because I can recognize myself in you a lot as well. So I can recognize many of the many of the behaviours that you display, I can recognise, and I can remember what I was like too when it happened to me too, because I too had cognitive reserve too, and that has helped me in my recovery too, and so that's why I believe that your future is looking bright. Your future's looking bright.
Well,
things will go well for you.
One funny thing I perhaps should tell you about my career was that part of my job for quite a while, I was what they call a project manager, and then I became a more experienced project manager, and I became quite a senior project manager. So what they do in companies when you actually can do quite a lot of project management, then they give you all the trouble projects, so all the projects that are not going well, and they say, can you please help us to fix these projects? So that's what in the last few years of my career, that was a big focus, was actually fixing trouble projects or very trouble projects, or actually managing large complicated projects that weren't going very well. And so at one stage I even went to Mexico for a project, and so some people who came from America who I knew that were in Australia, they actually told me, you're crazy, you shouldn't go to Mexico, it's dangerous. But the actual project was actually very interesting, so I did in the end go. But some of these things, I think what I would say is that somehow after I had the accident, I sort of could look at myself as like, well, in some ways I'm a trouble project now, and I have to somehow recover myself.
Yes. So now you have to project manage yourself.
It's a little bit ironic, but I could actually see I still had enough capacity in my cognitive capacity to actually work out how to sort of deal with myself.
Yes.
I just had to study a lot more about the brain because I really didn't understand the brain very much.
No, but that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And so that leads me on to now. What are your aims for the future? What strengthens you looking into the future and your approach?
Well, I guess in the short term, what I'm trying to do is recently what happened to me last year was that I managed to get back to some degree of self-independence. So, for example, if I want to catch a tram or a bus or a train, I'm allowed to do that independently now. So there was a period when the occupational therapists were a little bit concerned that I might not do that very wisely or very safely. So they didn't really let me go by myself for quite a long time. There was even a period where I wasn't allowed to walk into the shopping centre just down the road from us 1 kilometre. So I've sort of gradually gone through these steps where they've gradually given me a bit more, let's call it rope for want of a better term, but a bit more flexibility to do things as I sort of demonstrated a bit more common sense and doing things correctly. So now I can go through. So the last time the occupational therapist assessed me for catching a train, we went to Richmond Station, we came back, and then she told me afterwards that I could go anywhere. Now, I don't think she actually really meant anywhere. I think she was talking about Melbourne and this thing. But she did tell me that I should use the PDV app. So anywhere I wanted to go, I should plan where I was trying to go with the PDV app, and then I should try and follow what the app guided you on. So I've been trying to do that. But then I must admit that I was feeling a lot better. So my wife sort of said she wanted to visit her sister who lives in London. So we went on a holiday to Europe, and then we went to London. But actually London, we both lived there for more than 2 years, so we actually knew London pretty well. So I asked my wife, could I go on the bus or on the, like short distances by myself? And so I was allowed to do that, but my sister-in-law told me that I couldn't go upstairs on the bus, because when you try and go up the stairs, this typically the bus actually takes off just at the time you're trying to go up the stairs, and balance is not one of my strong points. So she thought that was not very wise. So I sort of took her guidance and I just stayed downstairs.
On the bottom.
But I did go a few places on the bus, and that was actually quite nice because I could sort of see just places that I enjoyed seeing in London.
Thank you for coming in and talking to me today.